Okay, it's 3 o'clock. I want to thank you all for attending our training. My name is Gary Mary. I'm the CEO of Carson and Saint. As the CEO of Carson and Saint, I get to see all aspects of our business, from the creation of additional functionality to the deployment and use of our solutions. Today, we're going to have Diane Reilly and Randall Laudermilk, both world-class technologists, come together and talk about how to maximize the effectiveness of a scan from our iconic security scanner, Saint, currently in its version 9.9. To be an icon, you must stand the test of time. Saint has been leading the vulnerability management field for over 20 years. Our Saint customers span both the globe and the business sectors. Diane brings unique perspective from the analyst and business risk management perspective, and Randy knows not only what vulnerability management is used for, but also how vulnerability management works for you. I'm excited about this session. We'll get to hear some very applicable and usable information from both the business and the technical perspective. I'm going to turn the meeting over to Diane and Randy now and take us through the vulnerability scanning for Saint and vulnerability management in general, and what you can do to protect your business. Sorry, Diane. There you go.
Okay. Thanks, Gary. I appreciate that. Thanks for the introduction. Before we get started, if you hang on to the end, we're going to be doing a drawing for a free 2-hour jumpstart training for those in attendance. And so just stick with us. So next slide, Quinn. Okay, so we're going to just kind of talk to you about the overview of how to scan in a meaningful way. What does that mean? Why it's relevant? What the components are of an effective scanning program, and then Gary's going to wrap it up and summarize for us. And so, next slide, Quinn. Okay, so we'll I'm sure he'll get that there in a second. Okay, so how to scan in a meaningful way. Well, what does that really mean? So we've all seen with the recent events in the news, ransomware, of course, and even industry warning notices that we're just been recently receiving, all to be on alert. It's really, truly interesting to me how some have said scanning is not relevant as it once was, but it's far from the truth. But you know, honestly, but really, how meaningful and effective is your security program? Oftentimes, the vulnerabilities exploited are already known. So how can scanning not be as relevant? It is relevant. It's core. It's a core to your overall vulnerability management program. And we know this because with, like, for instance, the recent attack on our nation's critical infrastructure when they didn't really know that a legacy VPN was active, or maybe, you know, looking at it from a major retailer, found AWS instances were spun up out of control by an R&D team, including in that workload in their scan. The businesses discovered over 1,000 vulnerabilities that were easily accessed by non-R&D users. And then there's even more examples from the public sector where, and I've known of this for some time, but a major cyber attack that resulted in a loss of all user credentials that were stored on an unpatched server. And I'd like to say that the server was patched, but because of the downtime, they just, you know, did some minor things to it. And sure enough, it got hit again. And then another public sector, as we all know, dear to our heart, several years ago, didn't take the responsibility for resolving risks that were reported by a third-party vendor and for multiple periods of times. And so that impact resulted in millions of records of sensitive information being stolen by a state-sponsored attack. So why am I even saying all this? Why is this really, truly relevant? And so, like I said, scanning's not dead. If anything, it's the core of your vulnerability management program, especially when you're looking to develop a scanning program in the context. And you need to actually develop that in the context of 3 different things. It's a multi-pronged approach. It's IT, it's compliance, and your business. And so let's dive in. Let's take it from the IT perspective. Some typically think of security as a boundary defense. However, endpoint detection tools are not enough. It doesn't address vulnerabilities at the patching level, for example. And it's so important right now that you really truly understand what's on your network. It's not about just understanding externally at the boundary defense level, but more importantly, internally too. You all know the old saying, you can't protect it if you don't know what you have. Know what's on your network. When it comes to scanning, we talk about individual IPs, IP ranges, whether they're external, internal, types of vulnerabilities, CVSS scores, CVEs, and more. So what does that really mean in business terms? It's a good question to ask. And then often we end up with voluminous reports, where people aren't sure where to start. I hear that all the time in the field. And that's really all results from not having a solid vulnerability management or well-defined vulnerability management program and a risk management strategy. And also saying you just really need to make sure that you have those things in place. You want to make sure that you're practicing it. You want to make sure that you're being consistent, as well as continuing measuring your risk exposure. And from a technical perspective, the scanner results, for the technicians, it's super easy to digest, right? And understand. But when you're talking to people like me and other leadership, there may be a language barrier or difficulty expressing, the technician may have difficulty expressing the risks in the business context, let alone trying to convey what the true impact is, and trying to reduce the risk exposure by remediating vulnerabilities. To us, we think it's all, we think of dollars. How much is it going to cost us, right? So we really, truly have to have a really good understanding. And that's where the IT and security and leadership all have to come together. And the last thing I want to kind of say from an IT perspective, and Randy's going to jump into this a little bit more in depth, is you really just need to make sure that you're tuning that technology to provide really good insight to your business security posture. Correlate what you learned back to the business processes and systems, okay? Now let's take a look at compliance. Quinn, you might wanna there you go. Look at it from a compliance standpoint. So when we think of compliance really means that you're following a framework, you're meeting regulations, right, and standards, and we all got to do it. And guess what? It's not going away. It's actually going to get more intense, more involved, especially with the latest and greatest with the DoD. If you do any kind of business with the DoD, you are now going to be subject to the CMMC standards and even the NIST 800 special publication 800-171. So all this compliance is really trying to make sure you have the goal in mind of providing adequate protections around sensitive data and making sure that you're monitoring it frequently. However, the one thing is compliance may only address a portion of it, like for instance, HIPAA or PCI or CMMC, but it's not necessarily focused on the whole enterprise. So also too, with compliance, we typically think of checking a box when we're performing a scan, not really doing security, right? And we see this all the time. And it's very short-sighted, I have to say, only because the real point is to make sure you have a good vulnerability management program in place, good remediation program in place, and the fact that you understand your risk exposure. It's not about checking a box, okay? It's also too, the leadership and auditors understand, and we truly do, not all vulnerabilities can be remediated due to budget constraints or not being able to afford the downtime. We get it. But we have to also understand where our vulnerabilities are and what that potential risk exposure is. So I will impress upon you that compliance doesn't mean you're secure. If you are secure, most likely you are compliant. But we have to look at security in a holistic way. And I like to think of security as really a combination of compliance, continuous monitoring, which is your scanning, continuous improvement, and continuous risk management. Now, the last and foremost, the last area that we have to take into consideration is also the business. And I know I've touched on this somewhat already, but let me ask you a couple questions. If you are responsible for scanning your organization or your customer's organization, can you tell me today what vulnerabilities exist by business function, like HR or accounting? Do you know the risk exposure, what the risk exposure really is? Has it gone up or down since the last time you scanned? Do you know the scope of what the organization's crown jewels are, where they're located, who has access to them, and what vulnerabilities exist? Have you adequately protected them? With cyber attacks on the rise, do you know what that impact is if you got hit with ransomware? Do you have the policies and procedures in place? Do you have your backups? These are just all questions you have to ask yourself. If you can't answer any of these questions, or only maybe a few, then you may not have a full appreciation of your business risks. Scanning to scan doesn't cut it. You have to shift your mindset from IPs and compliance and think bigger. We have to shift our focus from just an IP discussion to a risk management discussion, taking into consideration the business mission and tying the critical business processes and systems and the people and the data together to fully have an understanding of what your true security risk posture is. This really calls for a risk management strategy. Do you have one in place? And having a risk management strategy with vulnerability scanning at its core. That strategy should align with business strategic goals and objectives, and an organization's vulnerability management program should be tied to that strategy, identifying the potential threats, the likelihood, the impact, the risk appetite, your risk tolerance levels, and metrics. Do you all capture metrics? Do you know the importance of finding what matters and controlling what counts? You really need to focus on the things that truly matter. Focusing your time on things that don't matter is not really going to make your program any more effective. Measuring things, you really need to make sure that you're tying these metrics back to that strategic plan and your risk management strategy. You should be measuring this continuously. Now, finally, I'm going to more or less tell you one thing from a business context. And again, Randy will talk more about the components of an effective scanning program. But finally, security is a lifestyle. It's not a season. It's a shared responsibility. It's a team of one, including leadership, system owners, customers, third-party vendors, employees. You get the picture. It means that you have to have the buy-in from the key stakeholders at the highest management level, all the way down to each and every employee. We all play a role. And so now what I want to do, I just wanted to kind of set the stage for everybody, because it is so, so important to understand. Right now we scan, we can tag a lot of different things by location. We can do all this great stuff. We can see what kind of vulnerability may exist across multiple different devices. But what does that mean in business context? So Randy's going to actually now talk to you. I'm going to hand it over to him about what are the components of an effective scanning program and how you can address some of the very topics I just discussed. Randy?
Thank you, Diane. One of the things, I guess the general theme that you'll hear through a lot of this is we always talk about business context, and you kind of heard sort of the reasons for that. There's a phrase out there that says the real difficulty that we all face as technicians or cybersecurity experts is this whole concept of being able to take ourselves out of the server room and getting into the boardroom. And so it's a nice little catchphrase, and it probably makes a great t-shirt. But in reality, there's a lot of detail in there about how to create an effective program here, not just the mechanics of it. And so behind that is how do you speak that language? How do you set the program up, and how do you really create an effective program, not just the basic mechanics of scanning and reporting and the analytics and things like that. So, one of the first components is look at your, how do you communicate to your leadership, whether you're running a stock and having to talk to the CIO and the CISO and the system owners, or you're a managed service provider, a managed security service provider. You still have to be able to talk that business language because they don't look at risk the same way we do. The risk officer or the person that owns the business and has a stake in the game with their own money is looking at things like risk as, environmental risk, market risks, financial risks, competitive risks. And so when you talk to them for risk, that's what they're really talking about. When you talk to them about vulnerabilities, they're thinking risk exposure to my business. So when you're looking at how to scope things out, sort of that first component is looking at things in terms of the business areas, as Diane said earlier. What is the umbrella of what the business is that you're trying to manage? You'll get in, and it'll lead you down a path in terms of the targets, the remote sites, the mobile workforce, things like that. But it starts to set a framework that you're going to look at everything that you do back to the business. That's the only way you're going to get legitimacy when you talk to the leadership about when you're asking for money to run your program. You're trying to justify the funds to buy the technologies or get resources. If you can't speak the business language, then it's going to be very difficult to get them to play into what you're trying to do and make an effective program. So that leads to this kind of the second area, stakeholders. It's not just the people that actually install the technologies, run the scans, produce the reports, and have to report out, but the stakeholders, you're just one piece of the puzzle, from the CEO down to the functional owners and the tech staff and the third-party providers and things like that. You have to consider all of them in the way that you're setting up your program and the way that you look at the information and that you create in terms of how do you go about sort of creating the delivery of a solution or a prioritization of risk mitigation actions or do incident response and all those type things. You have to consider these stakeholders and where they interact in this overall process. So, having said that, then that leads you to things like metrics and the scope of what you're going to do. How do you define success? Oftentimes you're asked, how do I reduce risk? And they're expecting some magical number. If I solve this vulnerability on this server, my risk goes down by 3.5%. You can come up with whatever numbers you want to, but but you have to come up with metrics that, first of all, are measurable and attainable, and they also map to something that somebody can recognize. And I'll illustrate that, give you an example. I saw a program not too long ago where somebody was creating a mathematical algorithm, and they said, okay, if you do this, it'll be 0.00074 more effective. And you could have heard crickets in the room because that's not measurable and it's not meaningful. But if you said, if I take these 3 actions on this server, they interconnect to these business areas, and if we don't mitigate that, the risk exposure to you is impacting the customer's database and the shopping cart that sells our product. That's more meaningful. So how do you develop metrics that lead somebody instantly down to a measurable business impact? Not just if in the last month, I've mitigated, 73 vulnerabilities on 8 systems. Those are numbers, but they're not measurable metrics in terms of back to this area, this concept of business context. So when you look at that, there's also an opportunity there. First of all, it's a rules of engagement, which is absolutely critical, whether you're running the program yourself or you're a managed service provider providing a service to someone else. Who is responsible for what, and how do we go about setting this program up to conduct it accurately and successfully, to where we actually meet our stated goal of protecting the most critical assets. So, but in that opportunity, there's things like going back and say, in order to do this effectively, I can't just rely on just maybe a scan tool or just the end result. Maybe it starts with a business risk analysis or something like that, where you're showing them that part of an effective, meaningful program is I have to go beyond the mechanics of the actual tasks, and I need to tie that back to their risk tolerance, their business areas, what's critical, what's not. And often it's a difficult thing to do in reality, because many of you on here, I know you do this for a living. So you think about it in terms of, it's not just that critical server out there. If I solve that, if I resolve all the problems, problem solved. What does it interconnect with? Even what may seem to be a more minimalistic, impactful machine, if it's connected to the wrong thing, or identity and access controls and things like that aren't managed in a proper way, even just resolving issues on that one critical asset is not the full story. So you have to know how to look at that scope and understand how things interconnect. So when you're solving that business problem, it's not just about going after an IP address or a MAC address or a host name. You're talking about how you're protecting that business area. And that may not always be just something that might be the most expensive server in the room. So, we talk about that. You're talking about scope. We're talking about the architecture, the assets, mobile workforce, third-party vendors, ISPs. As we've seen in the last 18 months, this is also a very dynamic world we live in. I would guarantee you 20 months ago, most of us looked at the vast majority of the assets that were interconnected inside of a network with, whatever, division as far as cloud services and things like that. But everything that we talked about, stakeholders, metrics, scope, just flipped upside down when all of a sudden now most of your workforce is working from home. And so being able to look at these things in an iterative fashion and being able to adapt to the business nature, because their business changed, how they do business changed, but also what you have to manage changed. Technologies got picked up, dropped somewhere else. Network interconnectivity changed. VPNs became more prevalent in terms of what some people might have done more things in an office. Now they're doing 95% of the work through a VPN possibly. And as we just saw recently, VPNs are not the holy grail. You get something out there and it's just like any other technology. If it's not identified through discovery, if it's not managed as a resource, even if it happens to be a legacy system, it requires a certain level of technical skill that is not common by most people. And so this whole concept of, it's a point and shoot, ease of use, that's what you hope the tools can give you. It's the difference between a hammer and a jackhammer. They all serve a purpose and they're all useful, but the tool by itself does not get you to the end state. So that leads you down to a component about not only understanding your roles and responsibilities, but do you have the right knowledge, skills, and abilities and experiences to do this effectively? I can give anybody the proper tools and you can do the right thing wrong if you don't really put it in the hands of a true professional. And so sometimes part of this framework and these components is asking for help. I was talking to a gentleman not too long ago, and he said, I don't know everything I need to know to do this right. He says, I actually didn't start out in technology. It just kind of fell on me because we had some people leave. And he understood that he was out of his element. So they went out and found a managed service provider to come in. And, and so the combination of the tool sets and him looking at things from the business area and bringing proper expertise to the table, they were able to build a pretty good program and go beyond what they had done in the past. So, the component of an effective program is not always just about the technology. He understood that things changed, things are complicated, and you have to have a really well-rounded technical background as well as a functional background to do this the right way. And so, and even for the technicians that are on this webinar, you always understand that it's not a steady state. You're always learning, whether it's SANS courses or it's other webinars and things like that. You're always learning what the next thing is, whether it's the next attack vector or the next hacking group that's out there that you're trying to keep track of. Your environment's constantly changing, whether it's a network that has the same resources but they're using DHCP. Somebody spun up another local, another network at a different location. So you've got that background and experience to know that. It's not always just set it and forget it. You have to have the knowledge, skills, abilities, and experience to take advantage of this, whether it's setting up the methodologies and the rules, engagements, and actually conducting the work, but knowing what to do with the information once you obtain it. So that leads me to the business process, but also to the process you're using within the component of this program. Don't try to grow this yourself. There's a lot of expertise, whether it's through NIST or CIS or even some of the standards bodies, whether it's SOX or PCI. They spend up a lot of time and effort developing frameworks that give you a basis to work, whether it's ISO or it's NIST. The NIST cybersecurity framework is a perfect example. Don't try to go out and do this by yourself. Don't try to homegrow it. There's a framework out there that gets you, to what you're supposed to do. It may not tell you how to do it, but it'll tell you what component pieces are needed to do certain things, whether it's asset management or it's, developing a full risk management program or vulnerability management. So I really, advise people to, look at those type of resources that are available to you. So when you're setting up things, that you take advantage of work already done and expertise already out there to develop those lessons learned so you can set up your program effectively. Now, when it comes to technologies, we instantly want to talk about the vulnerability scanner as a scanner. But I will tell you, at least from our standpoint, we've been around about 20 years, and just the scanning technologies have morphed and changed so much over that time. It used to be, the tool that you ran a scan, got a list of things to fix, and you were done. Now, things have gotten to be so sophisticated that now you're talking about asset management, interoperability with a lot of different tool sets, whether it's DNS servers or, Active Directory servers or cloud instances. Just the nature of what you're doing in terms of just how you develop the tool sets, you have to think of it in a I'll use a word I know Gary hates, holistic fashion. But you have to look at how these tools interoperate, not just doing things in a vacuum. So setting up a vulnerability scanner is fine, but where do you get the asset information? How do you synchronize what you're doing? Whether it's connecting to Active Directory, we're well beyond the days where somebody just emails you a list of IP addresses and says, run a scan, give me a report. That's not what we're talking about in order to be effective. It has to be tied within the organization's framework, within those business areas, but also in the context of how it works amongst the other resources. Log management and SIM, GRC, MDR, a lot of acronyms in terms of the different technical components, but they all boil down to make sure that when you're setting up your methodologies and your workflows and your analytics and your reporting, that everything works together. And so you can take one piece and you can, it's what we used to call force multipliers. Let the tools work for you and let you become more than you can be by the piece parts that you've got in place. So that leads to another, I guess you give me an example, risk registers. If you do project management, you're used to hearing the word risk register. If you're in technology, oftentimes in compliance, you hear GRC. Well, the R in GRC is risk. And so many times the business looks at risk registers amongst projects, amongst programs, and there's nothing stopping you in terms of professional to consider what you're doing in the context of those business risk registers. So it's not just reporting out within your specific tool sets, but the interoperability goes beyond just plugging it into a SIM tool or having an MDR platform pull things together in terms of response and things like that. But businesses run and use it, speak a different language, and they also use some other tool sets, whether it's data warehousing or talked about risk registers, project management tools. And so whether it's ServiceNow or Forescout, some of the other technologies that are out there, think about what you're doing in terms of your overall effectiveness of your program, of how you can make the most use of the information you do obtain and how it feeds into a broader program. So that kind of brings me to, what I guess the meat and potatoes of the scanning components. We tend to think about as technicians, things like CVEs, vulnerability exposure number, but think about what you're trying to do in terms of risk mitigation in a much broader sense. Out of the 140,000+ known vulnerability enumerators are out there, is what they call them. There's probably equal a number of vulnerabilities and risk exposures out there that don't have that kind of an identifier, that CVE number. So things like web application weaknesses, misconfigurations, they can create risk exposures, but they don't by themselves have some kind of unique identifier. And oftentimes they're not tied to a patch level. So think about your scan, the type of scanning you need to do more from the overall risk exposure context, not just in terms of maybe a legacy or a prescriptive kind of a conversation tied to patch management, Microsoft, bulletin numbers and CVE numbers, things like sensitive content, misconfigurations, those type of things that we talked about earlier, web applications, that the risk exposures are not just always in like an Apache server that's a web application server. The custom application may have exposures where somebody can interject, things into web forms and things like that. But an effective tool will help you obtain critical information about that and get tutorial information in terms of how to mitigate against those risks. Sometimes it's not just applying a patch, it's going back to their stakeholders we talked about and says, hey, this custom web application you spent $10 million on has some SQL injection in it, and the end result is we're exposing customer data. An example came up, I guess a couple of years ago, I was involved in, we did an assessment and the customer really didn't take all of our advice when we came back and looked at their web applications. And the only time they really took it seriously was when a 14-year-old kid, literally a Boy Scout, I kid you not, 14-year-old Boy Scout, sent this company an email that says, hey, I was filling out my form on your website, and I noticed at the top of the screen in this URL, I saw this little number, and every time I changed the number, I saw somebody else's data. He literally was able to illustrate to them it wasn't just an assessor producing a report and briefing out, you've got a web application weakness. He showed him screenshots that every time he changed that number, he saw somebody else's home address, social security number. That's when they took it serious. But that's not the time to take it serious, is when you've been breached. So you think about the context in terms of you're setting up your program well beyond the bounds of what we typically think about patching only. It goes well beyond that. I guess another thing is data analytics, the time to value. If you set your programming up effectively, you've looked at technology and your targets back, say like asset identifiers. It's a critical asset, criticality equal high, function equals accounting, those type of things. So you're briefing out, I'm looking at the most critical vulnerabilities we've got out here tied to the most critical business systems. And I can align those with known threats out there in the wild, whether it's a threat identifier or known exploits in the wild. So I'm looking at that in the context of the business context of the asset tied to the severity of the vulnerability. And then next tied to the potential risk exposure. If you look at it more from a real world standpoint, if you've got a hunting cabin in the Rocky Mountains, you can leave the door open, your potential risk exposure is a bear walking in. But if you've got that same house setting in lower Manhattan, then you're going to lose everything. The bear may not walk in, but you come home and nothing's in your house. So you kind of have to think about the risk exposure that you're in. What kind of threat landscape do you live in? So to be able to tie the results that you've got not only to the criticality of the asset and severity of the vulnerability, but also tying that to the potential risk exposure and the probability of a breach, because there's known risks out there, or the known threat exposures out there. So we tie all of this together, and sort of where does it get us? So it really means that the priority on risk is basically, if you think about a math formula, we think about asset criticality plus vulnerability severity plus threat potential, known exploits, bad actors. And so oftentimes there's books written, that'll tell you how to create mathematical algorithms to give you, risk values. But that really only matters that if you understand the business context and the risk tolerance of the organization. So when you're briefing out or you're doing continuous monitoring of this data, that you're always focused on the most important thing to solve today. And that's why we say time to value. Let tool sets work for you. Instead of creating a 600-page report, if I have to solve a business problem at 3 o'clock in the morning, I would like the technologies and the way I've set up my program to allow me an opportunity to go let the technology give me a few mouse clicks and I can look at the most critical thing to solve right now. That incident response. Don't wait till somebody calls and tells you that your customer's database has been hacked. Let's go address it. But if you can look at the system the night before and say, I've got this critical vulnerability that just popped up and we need to solve it right now. And the technologies and the way you set your program up drove you to that conclusion the day before the hack happened. That's the holy grail, and that's what you're trying to do by looking at your scanning solution as a program, and not just the piece parts of the technologies and the steps you go through. So if you think about it more from like a financial situation, think about the average person that goes to a coffee shop and picks up a cup of coffee every day. Over the course of the year, they spend about $2,000 on coffee. But if you're a managed service provider trying to convince them to pay you $2,000 a year to monitor the most critical systems, where do you want to spend your money? At the end of the year, you're out $2,000 and just had a cup of coffee. But that $2,000 invested the right way might have saved your jewelry store or the coffee shop itself, or in practical nature, a multi-billion-dollar program might have saved you, billions of dollars in potential risks. And notwithstanding fines that might come out of a standards body like PCI if you expose a customer's credit card. So all of this collectively sort of means it's okay. I've gotten through the life cycle of setting up my program. I've got people, processes, data, and technologies, and all that worked out. But now I've got to do sort of what I call rinse and repeat. Did you learn anything through the process? What worked? What didn't? Adapt, correct, what was the good, bad, and the ugly, and do the continuous monitoring. As Diane said, there's one of the most effective program concepts of the risk for the cybersecurity framework is this notion that it's continuous monitoring. We're past the days of doing monthly scanning and monthly reporting and annual reporting to some broader standards body. You can't wait 30 days to find out you have a problem. So being able to take this program and look at your lessons learned and always adapt, and then, trust but verify. You do your patching after you've done your reporting, you've done your configuration changes, you've made business changes. Maybe you've done things such as, air gapping networks or segmentation to solve and mitigate problems. Okay, well, now do the exact same process over again. Verify how effective that is. And so it's really a continuous life cycle. So so in terms of wrapping up the sort of the concepts and the components, best way I could state it is rinse and repeat. So Gary, with that, I would like to turn the floor over to you, and we'll kind of talk about, just kind of wrapping things up and kind of bringing everything together.
You bet, Randy. Quinn, go ahead and go to the last page. Thank you. Thank you, Diane and Randy. I never listened to either of you without learning something new. With your combined 60 years of security experience, your approach to cybersecurity is very well grounded in interesting perspectives. We want to thank all of you for attending and open the meeting up for questions at this time.